May 8, 1945. Tuesday morning. The guns across Europe finally fell silent. Church bells rang in London, Paris, New York. Millions poured into the streets, dancing, weeping, kissing strangers. Victory in Europe Day. The bloodiest war in human history was over. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime crushed. The swastika banners torn down and trampled. For one golden moment, the world believed the nightmare had ended. But in a quiet command post in Bavaria, beneath grey skies heavy with rain, one man wasn't celebrating. General George S. Patton, the most feared and decorated battlefield commander America had ever produced, stood alone at a massive oak table covered in maps. His hands were flat against the surface, fingers spread wide, as if trying to hold something down. Something slipping away. Around him, officers were laughing, shaking hands, opening bottles of champagne they'd been saving for this exact moment. But Patton didn't move. His jaw was locked. His eyes fixed on the map. On the red arrows stretching across Eastern Europe like blood spreading through water. And in that silent room, surrounded by joy he couldn't feel, Patton whispered something that would haunt history for the next 50 years. "We've won the wrong war." No one heard him. The music was too loud. The celebration too overwhelming. But Patton knew. He knew with the same instinct that had made him a legend on the battlefield. The kind of knowing that comes not from intelligence reports or diplomatic cables, but from watching your enemy's eyes and understanding what they want before they take it. And what Patton saw terrified him. Because while the world cheered the fall of Berlin, Joseph Stalin's Red Army was spreading across half of Europe like a tide that had no intention of pulling back. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Nations that had been promised freedom were being swallowed whole. And the Western Allies, drunk on victory and exhausted by 6 years of slaughter, were letting it happen. Patton had tried to warn them. For weeks now, he'd been sending urgent messages to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. He'd been cataloging Soviet behavior. Documenting their brutality, their land grabs, their political purges. He'd been pleading for permission to keep pushing east, to stop the Soviets before they consolidated control. But Eisenhower, trusting Roosevelt's promise of post-war cooperation, had refused every request. And now, on this rain-soaked Tuesday, as the world celebrated, Patton understood that the window of opportunity was closing. Not in months. Not in weeks. In days. The nightmare he'd been predicting was about to become permanent. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. 4 weeks earlier. April 12, Patton's Third Army had just liberated the town of Ohrdruf in central Germany. What they found there stripped the humanity from even the most hardened soldiers. A concentration camp. Skeletal bodies stacked like firewood. Survivors who looked more like ghosts than men. The smell of death so thick it clung to uniforms for days. Patton, who'd seen combat across 2 world wars, vomited behind a barracks. Then he ordered every German civilian in the surrounding towns to walk through the camp and see what their silence had allowed. This, he told his officers, his voice shaking with rage, is what happens when good men do nothing. But even as he spoke those words, even as he stared into the abyss of Nazi evil, another thought was forming in the back of his mind. A darker thought. Because Patton had also been receiving reports from American units operating near Soviet forces. And those reports described a different kind of horror. Soviet soldiers executing German prisoners without trial. NKVD secret police rounding up civilians and shipping them east in cattle cars. Women violated. Towns emptied. Political opponents disappearing in the night. One report particularly haunted him. An American lieutenant had watched Soviet troops systematically loot an entire village, loading stolen furniture, machinery, livestock, and people onto trains headed for Moscow. When the lieutenant protested to a Soviet officer, the man had laughed. "This is how we liberate," he said. Patton read that report 3 times. Then he walked outside and stared east toward the horizon where Soviet positions lay just beyond sight. "They're not liberating," he said quietly to his aide. "They're conquering." By late April, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Everywhere the Red Army advanced, Soviet-controlled governments appeared within days. Elections were promised but never held. Democratic leaders were arrested. Newspapers shut down. Churches closed. The machinery of totalitarianism rolled in behind the tanks, converting liberation into occupation so smoothly it looked rehearsed. Because it was. Patton began studying Soviet troop movements with the same intensity he'd once studied Rommel's Afrika Korps. And what he discovered chilled him. The Red Army wasn't stopping. They weren't pulling back to pre-war Soviet borders. They were digging in. Fortifying. Positioning supply lines. Building infrastructure. Every move suggested permanence, not partnership. He called his intelligence officers into a midnight meeting. The room was lit by a single lamp casting shadows across maps pinned to the walls. Patton's voice was low but urgent. "Gentlemen, I need to know something. If we had to fight the Russians tomorrow, could we win?" The officers exchanged nervous glances. One brave captain spoke up. "Sir, are you asking hypothetically?" "No," Patton said. "I'm asking tactically." Another officer cleared his throat. "General, we have air superiority, better logistics, and higher morale. But the Soviets have numbers. Massive numbers." Patton nodded slowly. "What if we struck now? Before they reinforce. Before they consolidate." The room went silent. Everyone understood what Patton was suggesting. And no one wanted to be the first to say it was insane. April 25, the turning point. Patton requested an urgent meeting with Eisenhower. He flew to Supreme Headquarters in Frankfurt carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with intelligence reports, field observations, and a handwritten proposal that he knew would either change history or end his career. Probably both. Eisenhower greeted him warmly. The two men had known each other for decades, had risen through the ranks together, had planned D-Day side by side. But lately, the friendship had grown strained. Ike thought Patton was becoming paranoid. Patton thought Ike was becoming naive. They sat across from each other in a private office overlooking a bombed-out German city slowly rebuilding. Eisenhower poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "Congratulations, George," he said. "Third Army's record is extraordinary. You'll go down in history as one of the greatest battlefield commanders who ever lived." Patton didn't touch the whiskey. "Ike, we need to talk about the Russians." Eisenhower's smile faded. "George, please. Not this again." "Yes, this again. Because this is the only thing that matters now." Patton opened the briefcase and spread documents across the desk. Maps. Troop dispositions. Testimonies from refugees. Photos of Soviet atrocities. "Look at this, Ike. Really look. They're not our allies. They never have been. They're building an empire, and we're handing it to them on a silver platter." Eisenhower rubbed his temples. "We just fought the bloodiest war in human history to stop one dictator. The American people will not support another war. Not now. Maybe not ever." "I'm not asking for a war," Patton said, though they both knew that was exactly what he was asking for. "I'm asking for a preemptive strike while we still have the advantage. 6 weeks, Ike. Give me 6 weeks and I can push Soviet forces back behind the Polish border." Eisenhower stared at him. "George, do you hear yourself? You want to attack our ally. The country that lost 20 million people fighting Hitler. The country Roosevelt promised cooperation with. Roosevelt's dead," Patton said bluntly. Eisenhower flinched. FDR had died just 2 weeks earlier. The grief was still fresh. "Stalin isn't mourning him," Patton continued. Stalin is carving up Europe while we cry at the funeral. That's enough. No, it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. Because if we don't act now, we'll spend the next 50 years regretting it. Eisenhower stood. The meeting was over. Go back to your command, George. We're done fighting. We won. Accept it. Patton stood slowly, gathering his papers. At the door, he turned. We didn't win, Ike. We just changed enemies. He left without saluting. May 2nd. The Iron Gate closes. Soviet forces completed their encirclement of Prague. Patton's Third Army was less than 50 miles away, poised to liberate the Czech capital. Patton requested permission to advance. Eisenhower, under orders from Washington, refused. Prague had been promised to the Soviets at Yalta. The political decision was final. Patton was livid. He paced his headquarters like a caged animal, slamming his fist against tables, shouting at officers who had no power to change anything. We could take Prague in a day, he roared. One day. And we're letting Stalin have it. Why? Because Roosevelt shook hands with a dictator and pretended he was a Democrat? His chief of staff tried to calm him. General, orders are orders. Patton spun. Orders. Orders that condemn millions to slavery. He grabbed a map and stabbed his finger at Czechoslovakia. These people fought the Nazis for 6 years. They're counting on us. And we're abandoning them. Sir, there's nothing we can do. Patton's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes, there is. We can remember this moment. And we can remember who gave the order to stop. On May 9th, Soviet troops entered Prague. The Czech citizens who had prepared flowers and flags to welcome American liberators watched in confusion as Red Army soldiers rolled in instead. Within weeks, the purges began. Democratic leaders arrested. Opposition newspapers shut down. Secret police installing a communist puppet government. Patton received reports from Czech resistance fighters begging for help. He read them alone in his office, late at night, and felt something he hadn't felt since Ordruff. Rage. Helpless, burning rage. May 15th, the first prophecy. Patton called his senior officers together for what he knew would be his final address to them as their commander. He could feel the political walls closing in. His comments about the Soviets had been reported in the press. Washington was furious. Eisenhower had sent multiple warnings to stop talking. But Patton had never been good at staying silent. The officers gathered in a damp German hall that still smelled of gunpowder. Patton stood at the front, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who knew he was running out of time. Gentlemen, I want to tell you something, and I want you to remember it for the rest of your lives. The room fell silent. We just defeated Nazi Germany. And that was necessary. Hitler's regime was evil. Monstrous. It had to be destroyed. He paused. But in destroying it, we've made a terrible mistake. An uneasy murmur rippled through the crowd. We've allowed an even larger threat to take its place. The Soviet Union is not our friend. It is not our ally. It is a totalitarian empire that will dominate Europe if we don't stop it. He pointed east. Right now, at this moment, we have the power to push them back. We have the men, the tanks, the air superiority, the momentum. Right now, we could end this. But if we wait, if we let them dig in and consolidate, we'll never get this chance again. His voice grew harder. And in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, our children will look back and ask us why we didn't act when we had the chance. Why we let half of Europe disappear behind an iron curtain. Why we traded one dictator for another. The officers stared at him. Some nodded slowly. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Patton's final words were barely above a whisper. Mark my words, gentlemen. We defeated the wrong enemy. June 8, the silencing. Patton was summoned to Eisenhower's headquarters. He knew what was coming. When he entered the office, Ike didn't offer whiskey this time. Didn't shake his hand. Just handed him a folder. "You're being reassigned," Eisenhower said quietly. "Effective immediately." Patton opened the folder. He was being given command of a meaningless administrative unit. A desk job. A cage. "You're silencing me," Patton said. "I'm protecting you," Eisenhower replied. "Your comments about the Russians are creating a diplomatic nightmare. Truman is furious. Marshall is furious. You've become a political liability. I've become truthful. Truth doesn't matter if it starts a war." Patton looked at his old friend with something close to pity. "You still don't see it, do you? The war never ended, Ike. It just changed shape." He set the folder on the desk. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. And millions will pay the price." Eisenhower's voice hardened. "That's an order, George. Stand down." Patton saluted. It was the last time the two men would speak as friends. December 9, 1945. Monday afternoon. Patton was driving through the German countryside near Mannheim. His military career was effectively over. His warnings ignored. His predictions dismissed as paranoia. He'd spent the last 6 months watching helplessly as Soviet control tightened around Eastern Europe like a noose. Everything he predicted was happening. And no one cared. The car accident happened suddenly. A military truck collided with Patton's vehicle at an intersection. Patton was thrown forward, striking his head against the metal frame. His neck was broken. His body paralyzed. He was rushed to a military hospital where doctors fought to save him. For 12 days, he clung to life, conscious but unable to move. Visitors came. Officers. Old friends. His wife, Beatrice. They held his hand and told him he'd recover. But Patton knew better. On December 21, he died quietly in his sleep. The official cause was pulmonary embolism and heart failure. But rumors spread quickly. The accident had been too convenient. Too perfectly timed. Some believed it was fate. Others believed it was something darker. That enemies, foreign or domestic, had decided Patton's voice was too dangerous to leave unchecked. The truth died with him. But his warnings did not. 1946, the Iron Curtain descends. Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister but still a voice of moral authority, traveled to Fulton, Missouri. In a small college gymnasium, he delivered a speech that sent shockwaves around the world. "An iron curtain has descended across the continent," Churchill declared. The phrase was perfect. Haunting. True. It described exactly what Patton had been warning about for over a year. Eastern Europe had vanished behind Soviet control. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Nations that had fought for freedom now lived under communist dictatorships. Elections were rigged. Borders sealed. Dissent crushed. The West finally began to understand what Patton had seen in 1945. But by then, it was too late. The Soviet military had fortified. Their nuclear program had accelerated. Their political infrastructure was entrenched. The moment Patton identified, that brief window when the West held overwhelming advantage, had closed forever. 1948, the blockade. Stalin decided to test Western resolve. He cut off all land access to West Berlin, trapping 2 million people in an isolated city surrounded by Soviet forces. It was a calculated gambit. Either the West would abandon Berlin, or they would have to fight their way through. President Truman refused to abandon the city. But he also refused to start World War III. Instead, he ordered an airlift. For 11 months, American and British pilots flew around the clock, delivering food, medicine, and coal to keep West Berlin alive. It was a humanitarian triumph. But it was also proof of Patton's warning. Every flight was a reminder that Berlin should never have been ceded to Soviet control in the first place. That the division of Germany, agreed upon at Yalta, had created a permanent crisis. Patton's ghost lingered over every airstrip. 1950, Korea. The Cold War turned hot on a peninsula most Americans couldn't find on a map. North Korean forces, backed by Stalin and Mao, invaded South Korea. The United Nations responded with military force led by the United States. For 3 years, the war ground on. Millions died. The front lines barely moved. And when the armistice was signed in 1953, Korea remained divided exactly where it had started. A frozen conflict. A permanent border between two ideologies. Veterans who had served under Patton looked at the Korean stalemate and remembered his words. If we don't stop them now, we'll be fighting them forever. Korea was proof he'd been right. 1961, The Wall. On a Sunday morning in August, East German soldiers began stringing barbed wire through the heart of Berlin. By the end of the week, the wire had become a concrete wall. Families were torn apart. Friends separated. Lovers divided. People who lived on one street suddenly couldn't visit neighbors on the other side. The Berlin Wall became the most visible symbol of the Cold War. A scar across the face of Europe. And every brick, every guard tower, every death strip was a monument to the failure Patton had predicted. Because if the West had acted in 1945, there would be no wall. No divided Germany. No need for a concrete barrier between freedom and tyranny. Patton's warning echoed through history. The line we allow them to draw today will become permanent tomorrow. 1962, The Missiles. For 13 days in October, the world held its breath. Soviet missiles in Cuba pointed at American cities. American missiles in Turkey pointed at Soviet cities. Two superpowers on the brink of nuclear war. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev played a deadly game of chess where a single wrong move could end civilization. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. The missiles were withdrawn. Humanity survived. But the terror of those 13 days revealed the ultimate cost of Patton's unheeded warning. The Cold War had created a world where total annihilation was always one mistake away. And it all traced back to 1945. To the decision to let the Soviet Union expand unchecked. To trust Stalin's promises instead of Patton's instincts. 1989, The Wall falls. 44 years after Patton's death, the impossible happened. The Berlin Wall cracked. East German border guards, overwhelmed and confused, opened the gates. Thousands poured through. People climbed the wall, sledgehammers in hand, tearing down the concrete that had imprisoned them for decades. The images were jubilant. Powerful. Historic. But they were also tragic. Because every person celebrating in 1989 had spent their entire life under communist rule. Entire generations had grown up behind the Iron Curtain. Millions had died trying to escape. Families had been separated for half a century. And all of it, all of the suffering, all of the lost decades, might have been prevented if the West had listened to one general in 1945. Patton had seen it. Had warned them. Had begged them to act. And they'd silenced him instead. 1991, the collapse. The Soviet Union dissolved. 15 independent nations emerged from the wreckage. The Cold War was over. The West had won. But the victory was hollow. Because the cost had been staggering. Tens of millions dead in proxy wars. Trillions spent on weapons instead of prosperity. Entire nations imprisoned for half a century. Nuclear terror that shaped 3 generations. And through it all, Patton's warning whispered from 1945. If we let them take this territory today, We will be at war with them tomorrow. He'd been right. About everything. The Soviet expansion. The Iron Curtain. The permanent division of Europe. The Cold War. The nuclear standoff. Every single prediction had come true. But by the time history vindicated him, Patton had been dead for 46 years. Today, in military academies across the world, officers study Patton's campaigns. His speed. His aggression. His instinct for weakness in enemy lines. But they also study his final months. His warnings about the Soviet Union. His desperate attempts to change Allied policy. His prediction of the Cold War. And they ask the question historians will debate forever. What if the West had listened? What if Eisenhower had given Patton permission to strike in April 1945? Could the Cold War have been prevented? Could Eastern Europe have been spared decades of tyranny? Could millions of lives have been saved? We'll never know. Because the decision was made. Patton was silenced. The Soviets consolidated. And the world paid the price for 50 years. But Patton's final warning remains relevant. Not because it's about the Soviet Union. But because it's about the nature of power. About how empires rise when good men hesitate. About how the cost of avoiding conflict today is often paid in multiplied suffering tomorrow. In his final diary entry, written days before the accident, Patton wrote something haunting. History is not a story of good defeating evil. It is a story of men choosing between hard truths and comfortable lies. And the price of choosing lies is always paid by the next generation. He understood what few leaders ever grasp. That sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one you're fighting. It's the one you refuse to see. And the tragedy of George S. Patton is that he saw clearly. He warned loudly. He fought desperately. But he was defeated not by German tanks or Soviet numbers. He was defeated by Allied denial. By political convenience. By the human desire to believe the nightmare was over when it had only just begun. And so the man who tried to prevent the Cold War became its first casualty. Silenced. Dismissed. Forgotten. Until history proved him right. Too late to matter. Too late to save millions. But not too late to teach one final lesson. That the most tragic words in any language are these. He tried to warn us.